Greetings, this is Vaughn with Spirit of Health. We are going to talk about squash today. This video is all about squash, different uses of squash. It is fall here in Kansas City where we live, and we love squash in the fall. I think it's underutilized. We did not realize all the great things you could do with squash, so we wanted to share it with you. And we also have a yummy little dessert recipe that we're going to walk you through as well, called an acorn custard. So, it's fall, it's squash season. I have three of many different types of squash. We have a good old standard pumpkin here. We have a little acorn squash that looks like an acorn. And we have butternut squash. So these are three squash that we use a lot of. There's also spaghetti squash, which is amazing because you can use it in place of spaghetti with meals instead of using pasta and wheat and other products that can be damaging to a lot of people's health and digestion, especially in today's day and age. So squash, very versatile. What we're going to make today is actually called an acorn custard, and we're going to be using this type of a squash, an acorn squash. So let me move these to the side here. And first I want to talk to you about baking the squash. Baking squash is pretty simple. You put the oven on about 350 degrees and you put it in the oven for an hour. Now there's a couple of ways you can do it. We used to always take a squash and we'd cut it in half. We'd put it in a little bit of water face down in a pan and then put it in the oven for about an hour. Recently we learned you can just throw the squash in there whole and just cook it whole or bake it whole for an hour, and that works great as well. Here's an example of a butternut squash that we baked whole. It's ready to go. You're just going to cut this in half, and we would take the seeds out, of course, and then we'd remove the squash. Be careful of removing the skin, of course. You just want the squash. So for today's recipe, we're actually going to use an acorn squash, and we already had baked one and scooped out the seeds and everything, and we have our finished product right here. Here's some yummy squash ready to go. Now, besides this acorn custard recipe that we're going to make right here, just real quick on a few ideas of how you can utilize squash. Besides custards, we often make pancakes using squash. That's a GAPS-friendly recipe in stage 3. That's the little pancakes using squash. You can use, you can make muffins as well. We have a video on how to make GAPS-friendly muffins and pancakes both. Squash is wonderful just plain. So you can just take some baked squash like this, put some butter in it, put some ghee in it, put some coconut oil in it, put some cinnamon on it, put a little sea salt on it, a little honey, and it tastes amazing just by itself. Breads. The basic GAPS bread recipe uses squash as well. Now I'm going to tell you one of our favorite family things we've been doing recently with the squash, and that is using it in our bone broth soup. So say you make a beef stock or a chicken stock, you actually use the stock to make a soup, and we've been actually baking squash, putting that in the soup with maybe some onions and some carrots and some herbs, and actually blending it and making a blended soup with the squash with the bone broth. It tastes absolutely amazing. It makes me think of fall. Very soothing and healing to the digestive tract. It's a way we prepare it oftentimes when we feed our daughter Naomi bone broth soup. So squash in the soups is another amazing, tasty way to get squash. So let's get into the recipe here. We're going to make it's called an acorn custard dessert. Let me go over the ingredients with you. I'll put them in the mixing bowl here. The first thing we have is our acorn squash. Now, how much squash do we have here? A standard size acorn squash like this is going to yield about over 2 cups of baked squash. So this is about 2.5, maybe not quite 3 cups of squash. So I'm going to add that here. Now if you're using a butternut squash, of course the butternut squashes are larger, so you might only need about half of the butternut squash. The next ingredient is a ½ cup of ghee. I have actually warmed that on the stove just to make it easier to blend and mix. So I got a ½ cup of ghee going into our recipe there. And then the next ingredient in the recipe is a ½ cup of honey. Now we're only putting a ¼ cup of honey. Honey is very sweet, and we notice it tastes great just with only half of the amount of honey. So I'm going to put a ¼ cup of honey in here. Now the next ingredient it actually calls for is Dijon mustard. We do not use the Dijon mustard. That would give it a very pungent taste. I'm honestly not a huge mustard fan, so we've left that out. Because that's left out, I believe it's a good reason to use less honey. If you have the mustard in there, you might need the full half a cup of honey, but again, we're only using a quarter cup of honey. Like I said, we're skipping the Dijon mustard. The next ingredient is 3 eggs. I'm going to crack 3 eggs in here. Alright, we have our 3 eggs. I'm going to rinse my hands off real quick. Alrighty, and the last ingredient are the spices. It calls for cinnamon, allspice, and nutmeg, which I've already blended together right here. It calls for a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon, a 1/4 teaspoon of allspice, a 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg. I'll admit we cheat, and I especially like cinnamon, so I do a little bit more cinnamon than the 1/4 teaspoon, maybe as much as even a full teaspoon. So again, just to review the ingredients, we have 1 acorn squash, we have a half a cup of ghee. You could also probably use butter, that would be fine. We have a half a cup of honey. We used a 1/4 cup. There's 3 eggs. There's a tablespoon of Dijon mustard if you choose. And then you have a 1/4 teaspoon each of cinnamon, allspice, and nutmeg. So that's the final ingredient I'm going to add right here. And then I am going to whisk this up really nice and get this fully blended. And this is all the ingredients, very simple. And once this is blended nicely, I'm going to add it to just put it in a baking dish. Now a couple other notes, you want to preheat your oven to 350 degrees. We're going to bake these at 350 degrees. Doesn't take long to blend, so we're already pretty nicely blended here. And I've already greased our little pan here, our little baking dish. I greased it with coconut oil. That's what I chose to use. And then we're just going to very gently fold this beautiful batter right in here. And there it is. Look how beautiful that is. So again, 350 degrees on the oven. You are going to bake it for 30 to 40 minutes. We always find that it's at least 40 minutes. It actually depends on how thick it is as well. This one's actually quite thick, so I am actually guessing we'll probably bake this for about an hour. But the test to know that it's fully baked and ready to go is you're going to take the clean toothpick test. So you're going to take a toothpick, you're going to poke it in there, and if it comes out perfectly clean, it should be ready. You want to take it out, let it set up for a few minutes and cool, cut it, and it's ready to serve, and you will absolutely love this recipe. So I have that in there, again, for 40 minutes at least, probably more like an hour when it's all said and done. And when it comes out, you could sprinkle it with a little nutmeg or some other spices on top just as an additional topping. So we thank you for watching this video. We hope you start to utilize all the amazing ways that you can use squash. The last thing I want to mention about squash, in season, it's extremely affordable. Extremely affordable. We get these squash like this for $2 a piece. The acorn squash, $1 or $2 a piece when they're in season. You can go buy 7, 8 squashes at a time at the farmer's market, not even spend $20. A lot of people are on a budget. A lot of people struggle to eat healthy because they think it's too expensive. And it can get expensive, but there are ways that you can budget, especially if you eat in season. Get things at the local farmer's market when it's in season, and it will save you a fortune. And again, squash is very versatile, and you can feed a lot of members of your family with just one squash. So we thank you for watching this video on squash and acorn custard. From our kitchen to yours, this is Vaughn with Spirit of Health, and we'll see you next time.